All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for your participation in our stakeholder working group for the 2020 water and wastewater rate study. This is our fourth and final meeting of the stakeholder process, and again, we encourage your participation and questions throughout the presentation today, but also want to thank you for your questions and input throughout the process to date. As I mentioned in previous meetings, it's very important to us that we understand the questions and help you understand the way we conduct rate studies such as this one, and also that we incorporate questions and input into the final recommendations that we provide to our city management and elected officials. So with me today is Tara Ford. Tara is the Deputy Municipal Utilities Director, and of course Stephen White, who is facilitating the Teams meeting. And Laura Keifetz is going to help us with the facilitation of the chat function and question and answer period as we move through this and at the end of the presentation. So I encourage you to use that feature, but also there will be pauses during the presentation itself where you'll have an opportunity to ask questions or submit your questions for answers. So just a couple other things and then we'll get right into it in the interest of time. Tara, did you want to say any opening remarks before I move into the next part?
I just want to thank everybody for participating in this process. It's very important that we have all of your feedback. We can take that into consideration when constructing the rate study. So I just want to thank everybody for participating.
Thanks, Tara. And also I forgot to mention that there are several other city staff on the call today, so they'll also be available to help answer questions or make note of questions that we have to follow up after the meeting itself. So just as a brief reminder, just as far as the process goes, since we last met and also during the entirety of the rate process, we've been working with our consultant, Stantec, to develop a process, develop a rate structure and system that sufficiently puts into proper proportion the cost that we have of doing business, but also is sustainable and stable, and also a rate structure that's legally defensible and follows established industry best practices. So they've put a lot of time and effort into analyzing our customer data, helping us develop a very good understanding of where the costs to provide service come from and what is the most proportional and accurate way to distribute those costs among the various classes. So again, this is a very important process for us. Obviously, it's a lot of the stability of our community is based on the services we provide, and we understand that our customers and many others, including bond rating agencies and others, need to understand that we're doing this in a very systematic fashion, and we understand the ramifications of it. So with that, I will turn it over to Andy, Kyle, and Deb from Stantec to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Good morning, Terry. This is Kyle Stevens, and I will go ahead and get us started. This is meeting 4 of our stakeholder working group, and today we'll be talking about the rate structure and the data and the thought process that goes into creating a defensible rate structure that Terry just mentioned. And so as a little reminder, when we do a rate study, it's best thought of as a series of connected investigations that really build upon one another. And as we've had these meetings over time, we've been talking through the details of each of these, but the first started with the revenue sufficiency, which is, in the simplest terms, just trying to identify how many dollars we need on an annual basis over the next 10 years to run both the water and the sewer enterprise fund to provide service in a sustainable manner, fund all of our operations, our maintenance, our debt service, and our capital investments that are required. And then the last meeting that we had, we talked over the cost allocation, which is really an exercise in figuring out, once we know how many dollars we need, how do we divide those up proportionally to customers based on their usage characteristics. And I'll recap these as we go into this presentation today with the updated results and data that we have, but also to remind you where we ended those particular analysis as we go into the new material, which is the bottom portion of this screen, talking about how do we create rates? Where does the rubber meet the road, per se? How do we take all of this information analysis and turn it into the monthly rates that customers pay that sustain the operations within Tempe. And so rate comparisons are pretty complex, and we're going to be talking through this as we go into this presentation, but I thought early on it'd be good to put this up, and I think we put this up in our first Rates 101 presentation. This is a comparison of residential rates that are levied within the valley, and the color here indicates different tiers that apply, and so you can see kind of orange, gray, black, blue, and then a darker blue. And a couple key things that come out of here. When we're talking about residential water rates, it's very, very common to see some kind of differential pricing for increasing usage. And that is due to the relationship that we have on the utility side of the equation with peaking costs. And we talked about a lot of that when we went through the cost of service, the fact that the city of Tempe makes very substantial investments in the system in order to meet seasonal demands when those demands occur. And so the pricing here that you often see in the valley takes that into account. But this also makes it complex when we compare one rate to another rate within the valley, because they can be quite different. But what we want to do today is we're going to take a deep dive into Tempe's, where we set these tier breakpoints, and how we come up with the pricing that corresponds to the cost to deliver water within Tempe. So what we're going to cover for the water utility, we'll go through some rate increase scenarios, which is that first component of the rate study that I talked about. I've got an update for that to share with the group. I want to recap the cost allocation process, what we went through to arrive at the defensible allocation of that revenue requirement to each customer class. There's been a small update in some of the data that goes in it, so I want to show you the final results of that. And then finally, we're going to review the initial rate structures for each classification. And I'm going to walk you through in some pretty good detail our thought process, the data that we brought to bear to come up with the rate structure to ensure that it aligns with the cost, aligns with industry best practices, and is simple to understand. For the sewer utility, there's going to be no presentation on that today, and there's a couple of reasons for that. As we mentioned early on when we did the revenue sufficiency analysis, there's no near-term rate increases that are foreseen on the sewer utility. It's in a very healthy situation right now. The increases that we saw when we ran the analysis were about 5 years out into the future. And so no immediate change. Additionally, with regards to cost allocation, we had discussed the data point that was really critical, which is the loading in wastewater, or the relative strength of wastewater that different customers are contributing. That data hasn't been updated in a while. The city is looking to do an update in the near future to that data, and that will be very critical to the complete update of sewer rates. So we would expect to see that at a future rate study, but for the purposes of this rate study and today, there was no changes foreseen to sewer rates or the level of rates. With regards to water, this again is our dashboard, which is a summation of the analysis that brings into account all of the financial beginning balances, the expenses, revenues, capital investment, and debt service of the water utility over a 10-year period. And what we had done as part of that analysis is essentially looked at what level of rate increases, or revenue increases rather, would be needed in each and every year of our projection period in order to provide a sustainable future. And really the key charts here when we look at this kind of analysis are right here in the middle. So in orange is the cash out, in black is the cash in, or the revenue coming in from customers. And what we're trying to do as best as we can is align those two. And what you can see in this particular one is in the near term, the cash out's a little bit higher than the black line, the cash out. Just like your personal bank account, if you're spending more than you're bringing in, you've got to get that money from somewhere. So it comes from our bank account or our fund balance. And you can see over time our fund balance is decreasing. So we had looked at a couple scenarios with this. One would be don't do any rate increases, but if you did that, you need a really large one when these two lines cross in the future. And so this particular levelized plan shows what the rate increase would need to be in each and every year in order to balance those two cash in and cash out over time. Now, this is where we ended the previous presentation. We ran the cost allocation on this. What we want to show you today is a second scenario here. And this is scenario 2, I'll call this as we go through, which would essentially be to lower the rate increase in 2021. And so in this particular case, we've lowered the rate increase in 2021 down to 2.75%. And And what we wanted to show was the effects of that. And as you would imagine, there are trade-offs to that. So in this particular case, we need to get to the same kind of financial situation out here in the future as costs increase. So in order to do that, if we don't have quite the same level of rate increase in 2021, the rate increase in 2022 and forward needs to be a little bit higher. So in this particular case, if the city were to opt to go with scenario 2, it'd be 2.75 in 21 and then 6% thereafter in order to arrive at a very similar sustainable financial position in the future. And so when I go through the results today in the next few sections, I'm going to continue to show you that scenario 1 and scenario 2 side by side, because depending on the level of this rate increase in FY21, it will change some of the customer impacts at the end of the day that we see, because this is a lower level of revenue change in 2021. Now, with regards to the cost of service, for the city of Tempe, we provided a by-the-book cost allocation. There's a good amount of publication and industry thought leadership out there with regards to how to distribute costs for a water utility. The manual that we use is called M1, and it defines a process called base plus extra capacity. And all that simply does is it takes the overall cost, which is about $59.5 million for Tempe in FY21, and it first starts to break that up into the functions of the water utility. And so if I kind of like to think about this as how does the water get from its source to customers? And we start with the source of supply, we move to treatment, transmission, and distribution to send it out to customers. And then finally, we have a function for the meters and services, the customer facing portion of the utility. And up on the top here, you can see the dollars that are represented by each of these functions as they came out of that process. And this really involved a very detailed analysis, line by line in the budget, with the relevant city staff and utility staff that knows the system best, so that we could break this cost up into the correct components to perform the analysis. What we do next is then transform these functions to units of service. And down here on the bottom, it's the exact same total cost of 59.5. What we're doing now is breaking it up into essentially 4 key ways that the utility provides service, which is average day demand cost, maximum day cost, and peak hour cost. And these 3 fundamentally represent the different hydraulic demands and services that are placed on the system that Tempe has to meet. And so you could see some of the peaking costs that are represented by max day and max hour costs. And then finally, customer costs are kept in their own bucket off here to the right, which is again 4.1 million. We then, once we had the utilities costs separated into the correct components, we took a really deep dive into customer usage statistics. And what we're fundamentally trying to do here is match up the cost of the utility with the customers that are using the utility, so that we can have a great proportional relationship between the investments we make and the users that use up that capacity on the system. What this shows is a typical monthly view of that. So this is the 12 months of 2019. In black is the single family customer class, Tempe's largest customer class by customer count. And a couple things to note here when we look at these. First and foremost, you can see some changes in usage over time. So in the winter months, usage on the black bars for single family is quite low, but it does change pretty dramatically as we go into the summer months. There's quite a bit more usage on a monthly basis overall. We see some of the similar trends in commercial, as well as in landscape, which is this light gray color that goes up in a similar seasonal pattern. But for some of the other customer classes, such as multifamily, they maybe don't have as much of that seasonal change in usage, here shown in the dark orange, or in landscape, which is the dark gray down below. Now, we took this a step further, and so Tempe's made a pretty significant investment in its infrastructure, in its ability to gather data on customer usage. They've invested in advanced metering infrastructure. And what this simply means is the meters have been digitalized. And so the meters are able to record data on a much higher level than was otherwise possible in the past. In the past, often it was a physical meter reader that would come out and look at the meter once a month to determine the usage that had occurred. This automated metering infrastructure can relay the data automatically. And so we were able to get a couple different sets of this data. The first one here shows the ratio of average to max day usage for all of our customer classes. The second set, which is roughly 263 million individual data points for just 1 year, gave us insights into the peak hour usage for each and every customer. The real point here is this data allows us to perfectly align the cost of service, the cost of the utility with customer usage. So we don't have to make any assumptions. We can literally dive in, understand the utilization by customer class, and align the cost of service to be in sync with that. And so the ending answer when we do that cost of service is shown in this tabular format up above, which it talks about the different units of service. Whether it's accounts, we can see that in the case of Tempe, you've got a number of single family, multifamily, commercial, industrial, and landscape, total usage, and then these are our max day and peak hour. And the real key concept I wanted to show on this one is the graphic down here below. And this shows each customer class on our x-axis, the dollars and millions of allocated costs on the y-axis. And the real key here is that with our 4 buckets of costs from cost of service, they're proportionally distributed to customer classes based on their usage. And so an example of that in the dark gray here are the customer costs. So we mentioned there are a number of customers in single family. They're the largest by count of accounts. And so as you would imagine, they have the highest allocation of customer service costs, where multifamily, commercial, industrial have much lower counts of customers. But when it comes to hydraulic demands placed on the system and the cost associated with those, you can see in green, we have the average day cost. This is related to the overall kind of base usage of the system. And then in blue and yellow, these are the peak related costs. And so you can see certain customer classes, back to some of those charts I just pulled up, have higher allocations of those costs. Single family, commercial, landscaping have some of the larger allocations of max day and peak hour because they have larger seasonal demands that they place on the system, whereas multifamily and industrial don't have quite that same usage of the peak demands. But overall, it's allocated proportional to that usage. Now I have 2 of these summary charts. And so what we like to do at the end of cost of service is what we're looking at is in black, the current revenue by customer class. This is in this first example, the single family customer class, the amount of revenue that they are currently paying into the system. In orange is the calculated cost of the services that were provided. And oftentimes what we see is there's slight differences between that. And that's because we've updated the underlying data to understand the usage of the system. I've got 2 of these summaries. The first one I'm showing here is with the 5.5% increase. And I mentioned that a second ago. That's a real critical base assumption of what is that revenue change. Right now, we're going to run through with 2 scenarios. This first one is 5.5%. I'll show you the second one in a second. But as I run across this, what this shows in this bottom is essentially the high level summary. And so for single family, we need about 5.4% more revenue, recognizing we need 5.5% more overall from the single family class. For multifamily, what it would show based on the cost of service is there's a decrease in the revenue of 8.3%, commercial an increase of 7.3%, industrial an increase of 7.3%, and for landscaping 13.9% increasing. And that's those different changes are representative of their underlying usage and the cost of the system. Now the second summary is the exact same results, but with a slightly different cost basis. And so the cost basis in this case has now changed to 2.75%. So it's lower than it would have been in that first example I've showed you. The relative proportions are the same in the direction of each customer class, but now what you can see is for the single family, instead of that 5.4%, now 2.6%, multifamily is negative 11%, commercial is 4.6%, industrial 4.5%, and landscaping 11.1%. So that will conclude the cost of service and the revenue sufficiency. As we move into these next few slides, we're really going to cover the new material and the water structure changes that we'll want to look at. This first graphic is really a way to visualize what we're going to be doing in this next section. And so again, I've got my cost components off here to the left, customer costs, then the 3 hydraulic components, average day, max day, and peak hour. And then fundamentally how we're going to be charging those. And so in the industry, it's very common for customer costs to be included in the fixed component of a customer's bill and to be applied on a per bill basis. And so the rationale here being that customer costs are really related to serving an individual customer, and they're very much independent of the use of the system. So you can imagine whether it's a big meter with a lot of use or a small meter with very little use, they can still call customer service, and we still have very similar related costs for those two types of accounts. And for that reason, it's typically allocated on a one-to-one basis for per bill per meter. So with regards to hydraulic cost, average day costs are typically, some of it's included in the fixed base charges on a monthly basis, but the difference being we'll scale those by meter size. So those are really representative of the average use that the system is providing to a meter. And so a larger meter could potentially use more of the system. And so that cost will typically scale, which will result when we start to talk about fixed charges that increase per meter size. It's a scaled portion. And then finally, max day and peak hour are best recovered in volumetric charges. So those are really fundamentally related to peaking costs on the system. Those are best recorded in some type of volumetric charge that is connected to ongoing usage of the system. And some of the terminology we use, T-gals you'll see and you'll hear me talk about, and that is just typically thinking about this in terms of thousands of gallons used on a monthly basis. That is the billing period and the typical unit of measurement that utilities will use to measure usage, but we will have different rates for each customer class. And so I'll go through the data that goes into that. So with regards to fixed charges, again, we're going to have just a couple slides here because of the difference in that underlying change in revenue in FY21, the two scenarios. So this first one is at the 5.5% level. And the first block over here, we have the current fixed charges. And what you can see here is at a 5/8, it's $11.55 per month. But then, as I mentioned, it scales up for each meter size as we increase. So this is a 3/4 all the way up to an 8-inch meter. You can see the corresponding monthly charge that is associated with those size meters before any usage. The proposed updated that we've calculated for Tempe is applied using a couple different items. And so one key statistic and data analysis that we're going to bring in is the average usage between fiscal year 17 and 19. And this is the critical years of analysis we've included in a number of components in this analysis. But the reason this is important for our fixed charges is it gives us a basis to compare the different use on an average basis that each meter size has on the system. And so what we can see here is in 1,000 gallons on average, a 5/8 meter uses about 10,700 gallons. And then as we go up in meter size, you can see that average usage continues to increase. As you would imagine, customers are increasing their meters oftentimes because they have increased demands. And so the average typically scales up with increased meter size. And so how we would propose that gets used to create new base charges is first we would have the customer charge. I talked about that a second ago. We've calculated that based on the cost of service of about $7.44 per month per account. And what that would show is that essentially it doesn't scale, as I mentioned, by meter size. Those costs are not associated with usage of the system, but rather the ability of customer service or the cost related to customer service. The secondary portion of costs would be average day costs that are scaled based on that average usage in the table to the left. And so what we have done here is set a portion of cost that then scales up based on meter size. We then combine the two to create the fixed monthly charge. So it's a portion customer charge, a portion of scaled average day cost, and that results in an updated allocation of cost, fixed monthly cost for the utility. And one other key consideration is how much average day cost you put in here. And what we did is an analysis for the system overall of how much revenue they're generating from fixed costs. It currently stands at about 19% of total water revenue is generated in these fixed monthly charges before usage. And how does that compare to the overall industry? It's a little bit light. So what we typically see is the average is usually about 20 or right over 20. And the reason for that is because it helps the utility stabilize some of the revenue stream. and provides a buffer when volumetric revenue becomes volatile. And being where Tempe is located and the seasonal dynamics, the revenue can change and has changed in the past dramatically from one year to the next. And so this is a really key component of rate design. And what we have recommended as part of this study is that would be increased from 19% up to 22%. And it has been higher in the past and has decreased slightly to this 19%. So we're really trying to get this back into the 20% level so that level of revenues are stabilized. Additionally helps as Tempe goes to market to do bond financing for capital projects. It is one of the key statistics that rating agencies will look at is how much revenue is being recovered in the fixed charges. The higher that level, typically it's looked at more favorably, that the utility is more stable. Additionally, it helps the utility protect against unforeseen rate increases in the future if more of the revenue is in the fixed side of the equation. Now, what I've got for you on the next slide is the exact same math, exact same logic, but the base revenue has changed. So instead of 5.5%, it's 2.75%. And all that would mean is on the end of the day, and this is why this is important, is because instead of the $13 I just showed you, it'd be $12.80, and each of these corresponding would be slightly less than they were just in the last slide because we wouldn't need as much revenue in that first year. Of course, that comes with a trade-off that in future years, likely the rate increase would be higher than it would be with the 5.5% scenario. Now, from a comparison standpoint, what we did is for 5/8" meters, we grabbed the fixed charges that are out there in Valley municipalities to give you a sense of where Tempe sits. And so Tempe's current level is right here. The average is about 15. You can see down here, Phoenix has a funky looking border on it. And that's because Phoenix changes throughout the year as far as the level of that fixed charge that they are assessing customers. And so we've illustrated that they can be the lowest or they can be right here a little bit higher than Chandler. Main point here that we take away, though, is that Tempe is below average currently. There are a number of providers higher. The increases that we proposed in the last two would still keep Tempe likely lower than the average in the Valley for these fixed charges. And so for those reasons, we think it would definitely be worthwhile to update and increase slightly the fixed cost recovery for fixed charges. Now, with regards to volumetric rates, the second part of the equation, the charges that are related to ongoing usage, we're first going to cover non-single family. So non-single family volumetric rates, and there's 4 classes of those: multifamily, commercial, industrial, landscaping. These are charged on a per 1,000 gallons usage within a monthly period. And this is referred to often as flat rate charges, meaning that charge is uniform for how much usage they use within a monthly period. And this is very, very common within the industry because within these customer classes, oftentimes the difference between one customer to the next, you can think in the commercial, a car wash versus a restaurant versus a flower shop, the demands can be exceedingly different from one customer to the next. So a flat rate type rate structure makes the most sense, such that we're allowing those demands to change and fluctuate by each customer. These are the current rates expressed in dollars per 1,000 gallons. And how we updated our calculation relates to the simple formula that I'm showing down here. So what we took is that total revenue requirement that I talked about in cost of service. We subtracted out the revenue recovered from the updated fixed charges this I went over. So there's a total target, and then we have some of the money paid through fixed charges. And then the remainder is what we need to recover in volumetric rates. So we divide by the amount of billed volume in each of these customer classes. And what that yields then is a volumetric rate per 1,000 gallons that's tied to our cost of service. And so the updated rates, if we go down in scenario 1, are the ones that have the 5.5% increase in revenue. Scenario 2 has a 2.75%. So they have very similar trends in the way that they're changing per customer. That's multifamily going from 251 to 205, commercial 259 to 265, industrial 263 to 277, landscaping 351 to 396. But the second scenario will have slightly lower rates for each of these customer classes because it's calculated at a lower overall revenue level, and that's that 2.75. Now, comparison of rate plans over time, we put together this graphic because this concept, and as I kind of go back and forth between scenario 1 and scenario 2, you might be asking, what does that really mean, and why are we showing these so separated? And the really key concept here is in blue is the 5.5% scenario that I've been showing you. And this is just an example of the commercial rate over time to give you an idea of the trade-off that we're talking about with these two scenarios. So in blue, we would start at a little bit higher level, but as we go over time, we're only increasing at 5.5%. But by the time we get to 2030, while we're very similar, we're a little bit lower. In comparison, in green, we would start at 2.59, but we're going to increase at 6% once we get to FY22 and forward. And so you'll see that slope of that line is just a little bit higher. And at the end of the day, we end up a little bit higher than we otherwise would have. And so, again, just wanted to show you a comparison of those two side by side, taking the long view in the trade-offs that are connected to that lower rate increase in year 1 versus a levelized plan over time. Now, with regards to single family, I'll spend kind of the rest of the time on rate design talking about single family, and there's a significant more amount of analysis that goes into creating single family volumetric rates. And that is because you can oftentimes go to a second level of rate setting that allows us to differentiate the pricing per volume used within the customer class. And that is because single family customers look very similar to one another in the way that they use water and their normal usage profiles, such that we can break this up into defined categories or tiers and have defined pricing for each of those tiers on a monthly basis. And so this table right now shows the current structure, which is comprised of 5 volumetric tiers that right now currently range from 0 to 6,000 gallons monthly for the first tier, 7 to 12,000 monthly for the second, 13 to 20 for the third, 21 to 40 for the fourth, and then all additional usage falls into tier 5. And what I'll be going through in the next few slides is the analysis that goes into setting these tier breakpoints and the data that we bring out of the service area in order to help us define where these tier breaks should point. And then additionally, how this tier price is calculated, which is, in the case of this analysis, directly tied to the cost of service and the cost of providing those gallons of water within those tiers. So with regards to the single family tiers, there's really 2 types of demands that we're trying to create allotment for or tier for. This first 2 are indoor usage requirements. And so what we've done here, and we've calculated the census average household in Tippy is about 2.76 people. Now, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, provides good guidance with regards to what the essential indoor requirements are on a per person per day basis or PPD basis. It's about 70 gallons. And so that's the water that a person would need for consumption, for the dishwasher, for all of the things that you would use inside of the household. When you multiply these 2 items together, you can create an allotment for that indoor usage that's roughly 6,000 gallons per month for 2.76 people. And so the tier 1 has been set at that 6,000 gallons, and the data confirms that that's still a relevant point at which that tier should break. Now, with regards to this larger family, what we have done is essentially multiplied the average household by 2 to get to 5.52 people. We have the exact same 70 gallons per day per person allotment from the EPA. And what that tells you is there would essentially be a need for 12,000 gallons at a household that's twice the average for essential indoor domestic requirements. The first tier provided 6,000 gallons of that. And so the second tier would need to provide an additional 6,000 gallons in order to meet those demands. And that's why the tier goes from 7 to 12, and the data still confirms that that's a good breakpoint. Now, with regards to outdoor usage, the analysis changes in the data that it brings to the table and how we structure and try to understand the efficient usage for outdoor seasonal irrigation type demands on a parcel. And so this PERS graphic is a single family parcel distribution. And what it shows is on the x-axis, the square footage for lots increasing from 1,000 up to 37,000 square feet of lot size. And on the y-axis is the count of parcels. And so what we see here is in the dark gray, if you ignore all the other lines, we've got these bars. And you can see as we go from 1,000 to 9,000 or 8,000, these bars start to increase. And what that tells you is that there is a very standard distribution of lot size within Tempe. So a lot of single family homes have lot sizes that stretch between 7,000 and call it 11 or 12,000 square feet in size. We have chosen for this analysis to review two critical points. And so one is 9,000 square feet. This represents the 67th percentile, meaning when we conduct this analysis, we're going to create an irrigation profile for 67% of all single family lots within the city of Tempe. So that was all these lots that are behind this line. The second portion of analysis will consider a larger lot. And so what we've done is looked at an 18,000 square foot lot. At 18,000 square feet, that's the 95th percentile, meaning that 95% of all single family homes have a smaller lot, and there are only 5% of lots that are larger. You can notice these gray bars get really, really small as we start to go out here, but there are lots that are bigger. So what do we do with that information? We have conducted a sampling exercises to get a statistically valid sample of these parcels at both the 9,000 square foot and 18,000 square foot lot. And I've shown this in a map view over here to the left. And so in the blue are 9,000 square foot lots selected at random such that we could then perform an analysis on them. And red are the larger lot sizes at 18,000 square feet that we've selected again at random to perform an irrigation analysis on it. And that's why you see this rather scattershot view of where these parcels are located. There's no thought to where they were as a random selection such that we could determine how much irrigable area they have on them. And so off to the right, you can see an example of two blue lots at 9,000. And what we have done is in the GIS or geospatial environment, we've created this green hash marking. And what this allows us to do is to identify the areas on a lot that potentially could be irrigated. So we've tried to capture areas that have the ground cover, maybe it's a better way to say it, or don't have concrete or hard surfaces on it. And so what you notice is we're covering a lot of the green areas, but when we talk about a roof or hard concrete or a pool surface, those have been cut out of the analysis. This then allows us to digitally record and measure this area. You can see on different lots, this looks a bit different. And the larger lots shown to the right, they have even a different configuration, oftentimes with more irrigation around the structure, the main dwelling structure. And so through this analysis, we're able to pull in to the equation really locally relevant data with regards to single family homes and their potential irrigation area. What do we do with that? So this next few slides will walk us through that. What we calculated was on those 9,000 square foot lots, on average, about 2,700 square feet of it could reasonably be irrigated. So it looked like on the majority of those sample homes, they had ground or had area where they could irrigate up to about 2,700 square feet. What we then did is brought this into a little equation, which just simply tries to identify what the need would be to irrigate that area sustainably given the environmental demands in Tempe. And so the first part of that equation is evapotranspiration. And in the simplest terms, this just means how much water do plants lose to the atmosphere. In Tempe, given the desert environment, it's a decent amount of loss. And so it's about 83 inches a year. We then look at the annual rainfall. I grab the average rainfall for the last few years. It's about 4 inches on average. You've had a little bit higher, a little bit lower the last few years, but about 4 on average. So what this tells you is if you want to grow turf grass, there's not a lot of water being provided by the natural environment, given how much evapotranspiration is taking place. We then factor in the predominant crop type that's being used in the area, as well as irrigation system efficiency. Not all the water that gets out of the sprinkler head makes it to a useful use. Some of it evaporates off. And what this does then is it calculates what that efficient amount of water would be needed, 8,000 gallons on a monthly basis to irrigate 2,700 square feet of Parcel within Tempe's service area. And so essentially allows us to try to tailor the demand characteristics for the call it a little over average size single family home here. This would accommodate the 67th percentile of all single family homes. Now, that would then be essentially added into our tier structure to become tier 3. And so you can see tier 3 ranges from 13,000 to 20,000 gallons. That's the additional 8,000 gallons to provide for some outdoor demands to sustainably irrigate a turf grass. The 4th tier is for that larger parcel size. And so what we've done here is the input to that analysis, that irrigation analysis, now has an 18,000 square foot parcel and 8,100 square feet of landscape area. And so that landscape area has increased due to the overall size of the parcel and slightly increased overall as a proportion. Has the similar characteristics in the formula that we've included before. And what that yields is overall, in order to sustainably provide for irrigation on this type of a parcel, that'd be about 28,000 gallons monthly usage to provide enough water to sustainably grow turf grass. And so that is an additional 20,000 over the last year, recalling that we put 8,000 for outdoor usage in the 3rd tier. And so going back to our tier chart, that is how we arrive at that 4th tier, which gives us 21 through 40,000 gallons of monthly usage, an additional 21,000 gallons there. With regards to the pricing of tiers, fundamentally, once we get those breakpoints set up, then the question is, how do you price that? And in the case of Tempe, we're using a cost allocation process that fundamentally takes into account the changes over the year in the peaking that's happening within those tiered volumes. And so this graphic starts to display that. And what we see here is in black is tier 1 volume for single family homes. We started this graph a little bit differently. So it starts at the beginning of the fiscal year in July for 2019 or 2018 calendar year, fiscal year 2019. It shows the change over that period. And the real key takeaway here is that tier 1 volume, remember, that goes to about 6,000 gallons. Doesn't change too much, and that's exactly what we would expect. That water is really fundamentally being used indoor. Those types of indoor demands are pretty constant throughout the year. They don't necessarily change. But what we see is as we go up in the tier volume, tier 2, again, is for that larger size family home. You might have a smaller size that uses a little irrigation. So if we go from that summer going to winter to the right, what we see is a slight decline in tier 2 volume as we go into the winter months. So January, February, March are kind of the minimum months on the system for single family homes, and we see a decrease in the volume. As we move into tier 3 and tier 4, those again now are the outdoor tiers. We see a much larger change in volume. So as we go from the summer months to the winter months in the middle, you can see that volume or that distance right here is much, much smaller. So said another way, that volume changes pretty substantially throughout the year when we go from a winter month to a summer month. And then finally, tier 5, which is all volume over essentially 40,000 gallons monthly used. You can see that particular once we go from a summer and the width of this to the winter has a pretty significant difference. And as we go back into a seasonal summer month, it increases again. And that's going to be a really core concept as we talk about how to price this water and how to attach the pricing, recognizing that detailed cost of service, which identified peaking as a very relevant cost driver for the utility in Tempe. This little chart up here just shows the breakdown in average volume overall. So about 45% of all volume is in tier 1 for the entire year, 23 for tier 2, 15 is in tier 3, 11 in tier 4, and then 6 in tier 5. Now, with regards to pricing, what we've done is allocated the cost of our different units of service, the hydraulic units of service. We go back to, again, the base, max day, peak hour cost. In black here, what you can see is that average cost for each tier is the exact same. So it's about $167 per 1,000 gallons. But when we talk about the peaking cost, what you're going to see is different allocations of peaking costs based on that change volume I just went through. The fact that as we increase in our tiers, that volume becomes more peaky and the costs attached to it are higher. And so in the first tier, you can see there's a slight allocation, 6 cents 11 cents for peak hour and max day cost, gets us to a total of 184 updated for that first tier. Should mention this is also with the 5.5% revenue requirement. For tier 2, though, you'll see there was a little bit more peaking going on, so the allocation of those costs has increased a little bit, 44% for the max hour or peak hour and max day of 72 to 283. When we go to tier 3 and tier 4, these are outdoor demand tiers. We see, again, further increases on some of those peaking costs, brings us up to 389 for tier 3, 493 for tier 4, and 542 finally for tier 5, which has the larger allocation on a per 1,000 gallon basis for max day and peak hour cost. Now, I just changed slides, and what we did is updated just for that revenue requirement of 2.75. And so a similar allocation process, identical in fact under the hood, just again, a slightly different revenue requirement in fiscal year 21, which results in slightly different prices per tier because we don't need to collect as much revenue. Now, this next slide will compare these two. And so what we've got in black is the current structure or the current pricing for tier 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the tan color or light peach color is the scenario 1 with the 5.5% increase. So that would show tier 1 would go up slightly to 0.84. Under scenario 2, it'd actually be at 0.8. And the reason it's very similar in that first one is we have a little bit of change in fixed cost recovery, which mostly affects this first tier. And then you can see as we step into tier 2, the relative change from current to the scenario 1, scenario 2. Tier 3, again, we have a change that would increase the most for scenario 1, a little bit less for scenario 2. And then tier 4 and tier 5. And the really important part to get across here is the two scenarios, again, are important because of the different revenue requirement. But the updated pricing being these two scenarios represents the recognition of the most recent and current data available for the service area and the cost of providing that water in each one of those tiers. And so it's a very defensible construct for pricing. So with that, what I'll move into is just the customer impacts. This is the last part of this analysis is really to take it to the kitchen table and to try to show this in a manner that demonstrates what a customer would actually see in their particular bill that they receive. And so what we've done is tried to put a few really common configurations for customer bills, especially on the single family side. And so this first one is a 3,000 gallon per month user. It's kind of a smaller household with indoor use is probably the best way to think about it. This is a 5/8 meter, 3,000 gallons of water use and 3,000 gallons of sewer use for this particular example. What that would show is their current bill is $32.72. Scenario 1, they would move up to $34.49. Scenario 2 would be $34.02. The relative change for these two would be $1.77 monthly or $1.30, 5.4% or 4% under scenario 2. Again, scenario 2 is that lower revenue requirement. Now, so I changed slides, we're going to move up. So in this particular one, it's a smaller household with some outdoor usage. In this particular case, we've got 7,000 gallons of monthly use, 5,000 gallons of sewer. There's some winter averaging that takes place in Tempe that lowers that sewer allocation for this particular household. And so what we see here is bill's a little bit higher. It's $44.29. Under scenario 1, it'd move up to $46.52. Under scenario 2, it'd be just a little bit lower at $45.86. The relative change here is 5%, 3.5%, kind of at a monthly basis, $2.23 or $1.57. Now, as we move up into the higher users, this is kind of a small household with some outdoor use, or you can think about this as a larger family, about 10,000 gallons monthly. And so we're stepping up into that next tier from a pricing standpoint when we go to 10,000 gallons monthly. That's, again, a 5/8 meter, 7,000 gallons of sewer. Current bill's $55.44. Scenario 1 would move them up to $58.69. Scenario 2 would be $57.82. From a proportional change, that's about $5 or 5.9%. or 4.3% under scenario 2, $3.25 a month, or $2.38 a month for those two scenarios. Now, a larger household with very significant outdoor usage is shown in this example. So this is 50,000 gallons of monthly usage. This is also a 1-inch meter. So typically when that usage gets up, the household or the connection will upsize the meter so that they have adequate pressure. We're showing 50,000 gallons of water use on this one, and we're showing 12,000 gallons of sewer use. What that shows is that current bill is about $268.82. Under scenario 1, it would move up to $281.27. Scenario 2 would be $275.21. About a 4.6% change, 2.4% change under scenario 2. And on a monthly basis, from a dollar standpoint, it'd be $12.45 and $6.39. With regards to some non-single family impacts, these next two will cover that. So here's a commercial customer. This will show commercial usage with 150,000 gallons on a per month basis. Tempe sewer usage is ratioed off of the water usage. And so for this customer, it's a 90% return factor, which means that sewer is billed on about 135,000 gallons of use. What this shows, their current bill is roughly $942.10 a month. Scenario 1 would be $947.80. Scenario 2 would be $963.40. 3.5% change or 2.3% change respectively for that total bill, $32.70 monthly or $21.30 monthly for the two scenarios. And then finally, I have an industrial customer. And in this particular example, we're showing 15 million gallons of usage per month with no sewer return flow for this particular example. Their current bill for this industrial customer is about $40,000 and $850 monthly. Scenario 1 would put it at $43,554. Scenario 2 would put it at $42,452. From a change standpoint, it's about 6.6% under scenario 1, 3.9% under scenario 2. And then from a monthly impact, it's about $2,700 and $1,600 respectively. And this is an 8-inch meter. So this is one of the larger customers on Tempe's system. Additional to the bill impact, some of the thoughts that we had as we went through this study that we thought we would additionally put in here for the group's consideration is just with regards to affordability. Within the water industry, affordability is an ongoing concern. There's, as we've gone through this analysis and you've seen and we've talked about the basket of goods and services that a utility has to buy on an ongoing basis to provide sustainable services. And those are oftentimes going up in price faster than inflation over time. And so affordability is top of mind. One of the first steps that really addresses that is going to cost of service-based rates. And that's really what we've tried to accomplish within this rate study is to systematically go through, identify the amount of revenue needed, identify the way to split that revenue between customer classes, and come up with rates that fully reflect the cost of service. And so that ensures that those peak costs that are one of the key drivers and key considerations are correctly allocated to the customers that proportionally use those, and that all rates charged to customers reflect that true cost of service. But in addition to that, it's very common for communities to go beyond just rates. And so, some thoughts out there that continue to work with the community to meet the needs of those with affordability challenges. Oftentimes, those are met in 3 different ways that are outside of rates. Proactive customers through communication through customer service. Oftentimes, there might be partnerships that can be made with other organizations in the community that can avert crisis needs when those occur. And then also, third would be consideration of funding outside of rates that would help provide for those that face long-term affordability challenges. Additionally, what I wanted to show in these last few slides is just a survey again, taking the stock of where we are in the valley with some of these updates. So this shows our scenario 1 update, which is the 5.5% increase. In blue is the water bill and in green is the sewer bill. So for this particular customer at a 7,000 gallon usage level, the average in the valley is about 54.08. What this shows is with the updated rates in FY21, it'd be 44.29. And so key takeaway here is that Tempe would still be kind of below average in the valley at this usage level. And that doesn't even account for the fact that many of these utilities will likely experience some level of rate increase in the future. So they won't stay static. Much like Tempe, they have some of the similar cost pressures and considerations that go into creating their rates that they analyze. And so I would expect these to move up as well if we were to redo this survey in a year or two. An additional survey here, we've upped the usage amount to 10,000 gallons of water, 7,000 gallon sewer. Valley average 6836, shown here in black. What we're showing is that usage level Tempe is again very, very competitive at 5544 for that total bill for water and sewer services. Only Chandler is below them. And the larger side of the equation, we've got the 1-inch meter that I showed you a second, that 50,000 gallons of water use and 12,000 gallons of sewer. You can see the bill breakdown. The water is a much larger portion. Again, most of the other valley communities have some kind of inclining block pressure or rate structure that provides that conservation signal and that pricing to recognize peak cost. What you see there is with that Tempe is essentially dead on the average. And so the black line is about 268.94. The calculated rate is very, very close to that, slightly below it for Tempe. And there are a considerable number of communities that would actually be higher at that usage level going forward. But very, very competitive. So just a quick recap on where we are today as we end kind of the formal presentation and go into more of the dialogue and discussion component of today's meeting. We have completed up to this date rates 101. It was 6.2. Revenue sufficiency workshop on 6.9, where we talked about the annual needs of the system. Cost of service workshop on 7.7. And then today, after today, we will have completed the rate structure workshop, which is our last meeting together. To cover the elements of how we actually come up with the pricing and the rate structure. So Steve, I think maybe turn it back over to you and any questions or discussion, we can happy to jump into it.
Thank you, Kyle. Laura Kaifez is actually going to be moderating the discussion. So feel free, anyone, to either type in your questions using the chat feature, or if you have a microphone and can verbalize your questions, please do that as well.
Hey, Steve, this is Andy with Stantec. Just real quick, I wanted to clarify one thing. Kyle, when you were going through the cost comparison slides to other communities in the Valley, I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that was with Tempe's current rates, just to clarify. So for all of
thank you, Andy.
Yeah, for all these charts, I think Kyle, you may have said it was scenario 1, but these are actually just current rate comparisons because we don't have specific knowledge about what additional rate adjustments others might be proposing. So we wanted it to be apples to apples with what's in place today.
Correct. Appreciate it, Andy. Thank you.
Yep.
This is Kath Olmstead. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question. As you guys went through all of this, in the very beginning, we talked about the problems that the larger lots in Tempe are having with the rates that were being charged. And we talked about some different options, and you guys talked about maybe looking at some different scenarios of how you could help those of us that are on larger lots. And I didn't see any of that reflected today in your presentation. We have a lot that's just over an acre. So, you know, when you're talking about those lots that you were looking at, the different sizes, you didn't go anywhere near what an acreage would be. You know, I think an acre has 43,000 square feet. So, you know, I get a notice every day from the city of Tempe on my phone, a text that says that you've used, like just while we were talking, I got my text today. I've used over 2,800 gallons, 2,809 gallons yesterday. So there's only 2 of us in this house. We don't use very much water at all. And so the problem is, you know, my sprinklers go off. If you would come by my house, you would be embarrassed at how dead my lawn is. I mean, it's barely, I would say 50% of it is brown, 50% of it is green. I've cut my watering back so far that I can't keep it green. But we have lots of trees and lots of bushes, and I'm trying to figure out where in this, it doesn't look like you have taken into account those of us in South Tempe especially that, have these large lots. And, my water bill last month was $553. And that's with cutting my water back as far as I can. I've even turned off my autofill on my pool, and I just do it manually just to make sure that it's not using any more water than I have to. So I've done everything that I possibly can. And, there's a lot of us in this neighborhood that are in the same boat. I talk to my neighbors, and some of my neighbors are tearing trees out. It's ridiculous. We need something that can help us be able to afford our water bills and keep our lawns without going to rock and desert. So I'm looking for some input on what you took into account for this.
So happy to start it off and kind of give you some general thoughts. Andy, you might have some more, so feel free to jump in as well. The first thing with regards to outdoor usage and when we set these tier structures, first thing to consider is when we do this, we have to set these rates and we have to set the tier breakpoints, kind of recognizing the overall profile of customers within the entirety of the community. And so a lot of the data points that I've presented and that you've seen us walk through, including the outdoor usage, you can kind of see it as best, as you pointed out, when you get up on this chart, the majority of lots are much smaller size. And so they're, the average is right around a little under 8,000 or 8,000 or so square feet. We, though, as part of the rate structure, did incorporate that much larger lot size, which is about 18,000 square feet, 95th percentile, meaning that should incorporate 95% of all single family homes within Tempe's community. Totally understand your consideration, the fact that, on this chart, even on the x-axis, that 43,560 breakpoint, that 1 acre that you mentioned, is pretty far over there to the right and represents, kind of the 99th percentile, if you will, of large lots within Tempe. And so the rate structure, when you set it, there's nothing necessarily from a pure rate structure standpoint that you can do. If you increase that up there, it's still going to be some of the top water usage, and the cost of that water, as we've talked about, is really key consideration. That peaking demand is relatively expensive for the municipal system. Some of the thoughts through the community, I know they have some of the conservation programs, and they do have a program in place where if you sign up for it, you can, I believe, get out of the tier 5 pricing if you can keep your demands at a certain level or demonstrate that they have come down a little bit. Andy, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, just maybe kind of a little bit of elaboration on some of the things you're talking about, Kyle, is that, we just don't have, within the current systems and context, the ability to do kind of individualized customer specific tiers, at this point in time. That's something that, we do see in California, where every customer has a specific set of tiers that are developed, but that's a very few number of utilities in California, and it's really not applied anywhere outside of the country because of some very significant technical and administrative limitations and costs associated with doing that. So absent going to that type of a system, what we've done here is really tried to make allowances, as best we can to try to accommodate for some of those things, both directly and indirectly. And when I say indirectly, when Kyle was going over some of the indoor usage assumptions at 70 gallons per day, that's kind of the, for homes that maybe haven't done any current updates or remodeling, maybe have some leaks. California, Texas, they've adopted indoor, state water standards of 50 gallons a day, and even more efficient homes today get down to 40 gallons today. And if you have a smaller household size, chances are you're probably getting into some irrigation, even in potentially that first tier or that second tier, which is why we saw some of those peaking costs go to those tiers. So, we're trying to use profiles to set up the rate structure as best we can, recognizing we can't get this perfect for every individual customer. And in so doing, we've made conservative assumptions to make sure those allowances are as fair as they can be and kind of customer oriented, such that, there's from the description of your particular property, it sounds like if it's, you don't have many folks in the house, you're probably getting some of the irrigation at those, very low rates, which helps offset some of your concerns. And I think, as Kyle pointed out, the demand management program may be another way to address some concerns additionally as well, to the extent that, that program is something that the city is going to continue to offer, that may also be part of the solutions to mitigate some of your concerns.
Is there not a way that you can, like, we irrigate in the middle of the night? Is there not a way to, with all of the digital technology that we have now on our meters, isn't there a way to say, okay, if they're using 20,000 gallons a night between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m., obviously it's not people up using that water. Isn't there a way to do a different tier structure for different hours?
So we really haven't seen yet in the water industry, and I say yet, like we have in the electric industry, time of use rates. I think we're all within the water industry optimistic that day will be coming at some point in the future, when we do have the systems and the ability to do that, because we're now seeing communities start with the advanced metering infrastructure, which is the first step in being able to do some of these more specific and granular types of billing practices. So we're optimistic we'll see it, but the water industry is typically lagging behind the electric industry, which does things like that time of use rates by a few years. But that's certainly something that, I would think would be considered in the future when the technology and systems would allow for it. But in the interim period, I think, Steve, this kind of goes, to kind of the demand management program, that have been piloted, and potentially trying to bridge that gap for those that are able to control the time of use of some of those discretionary water demands.
Thanks, Andy. That demand management is really about just working with conservation and becoming water efficient, getting a water efficiency certification through our Water Conservation Office. And what that provides over a 12-month pilot period is if you commit to working in that program, that you're billed at the Tier 4 rate, you would not top out with the Tier 5 rate. And that's a pilot that City Council has authorized, I believe it was last June. If that was to continue on in the future, certainly that would be a council decision, but that's exactly what has been done to date to address large lot owners with a lot of turf and trees to assist with their not only a water bill, but also their demand management, as far as being as efficient as possible with their water, watering of their lawns.
I am part of that program, and we also updated our meters, our sprinkler meters, so that we are on the digital, ratio meters, so that so that the city made sure that we were doing everything that we could. We literally have done everything we could possibly do to bring our rate. Last year, my water bill was over $800 for 1 month, and making the changes that we've made and done everything that we could. We've turned down our watering times. We even water less than what your city recommends. They're like, that's not going to be enough water. I'm like, well, I can't afford to water as much as I need to keep my grass green. And they're like, well, maybe you could, they give me these ideas. I work with your city water department all the time. They know me. But it's ridiculous that people are having to spend, $500, $600, $700 a month on water, because 90% of what they're using is for landscaping. So I just think it needs to be readdressed. I understand that, maybe you don't have the technology yet, but there are things that I think can be done for specific, like you said, if there's only 5% of the city that has the large lots that the city approved, that's the thing that frustrates me, is you guys approved it. You guys have always pushed for a green city. Now we have green lots, and we're being absolutely punished for this. And so it just seems like there's something that can be done for the 5% that have these acre lots, and at least give us some sort of a cost break, because it doesn't look like it's really been taken into account in this study.
Cass, thanks for your comments and feedback on appreciate that. Laura, did you want to start answering some questions that are in the chat? Laura, do we have Laura? My apologies. I'm gonna start reading the questions, and I can't hear Laura unless she's on mute. Let's see here. Delia has asked a question with respect to unequal water conservation. Isn't reduction of lawns a priority? Oh, Laura just responded. Mic is not working. I wouldn't say a reduction in lawns has been a priority by any mayor and council members that I've never heard any of them say that, nor has the water utility recommended that. Our focus is really on watering efficiency. Just whatever landscape that you choose to have, just to water it as efficiently as possible. So we're not wasting any water. So I don't know if there's any other staff on the call that would like to respond to that as well. But to my knowledge, I don't. We do have a rebate program for turf removal if that's something you desire. We can, but that's not something that we necessarily are recommending.
Just checking, can you guys hear me now? I signed back in.
Yes.
There you are, Laura.
Oh, good. Geez, I don't know what happened there. All of a sudden I was gone.
Steve, this is Terry. I just want to comment on your response to that question and just reiterate that, yes, our council direction we've been given is not about necessarily reducing the amount of grass or turf cover or anything like that, but really our focus, one of the major focuses of our utility is to work with customers to reach the point that their watering technique practices and such and their systems are as efficient as possible. So we also understand that, you know, there are limitations to that in terms of, you know, the previous question that was raised, and I know that's a sort of a longer standing question, but you know, when you have a very large surface area with a very large amount of turf or plants, greenery, it's going to require a certain volume of water, even if you have reached a high level of efficiency. So we understand that, but we want to do all we can as a community, for our community as a utility, to create a scenario where we're doing it as best we can collectively. So that's the purpose of not only the sort of rebate programs and the programs to move out of Tier 5, but really the core of our conservation program is not necessarily conservation other than in terms of efficiency. That's what we're moving towards. So no, just officially there's been no direction to try to encourage or move toward that, but certainly our council has provided sort of policy direction in terms of sending it the conservation signal that was mentioned by Kyle previously, which is very much in alignment with industry standard across the U.S. It's not a new concept. It's something that's been really going on for the last 20 years. But that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, go from turf to xeriscape. It just means being as efficient as we can be in the use of our water in terms of all water customers. So, but we understand there's going to be different volumes, and that's why we have this structure. But as was mentioned previously, it's difficult to capture without great cost and great administrative overhead every single type of customer. We have to try as best we can to make it proportional to groups in general as we can identify them. So anyway, I know that was a long-winded answer to two questions, but I just wanted to provide that. So Laura, back to you.
Yeah, Delia, if we've got that answered for you, I'm going to move on to Carmen. Carmen made a comment. She said, I'm concerned about what the city is doing to ensure that we have water in the valley in the future. We live in the desert, and the big businesses and their offices keep coming. I like that, but I also worry about whether the city is ensuring that we are not going to run out of water.
Tara and I can probably best touch base on our chime in on this particular one. As I sort of mentioned previously, but it's incorporates the approach, water resources, long-term drought resiliency, system efficiency, different sources of water. We have a multitude of different infrastructure investments that we're making. We also have investments we're making in opportunities for additional sources of water. Again, we're always looking for ways to improve the efficiency of our system as a whole, which also creates a certain level of resiliency moving forward. We have a very secure supply of water. We have the luxury of surface water availability as well as groundwater, and we're always looking for opportunities to leverage other sources such as reclaimed water recharge and recharging our aquifer, so that if we were to get in a situation where we needed to supplement our supply of surface water for a period of time, or if we experienced a drought condition, that we could do so without impacting, obviously, our customers, whether they be commercial, industrial, or residential. So we have a very robust program. Our council has been very supportive in this area. Like I said, and as you've seen in the presentations to date, we have a robust CIP. We replace and add infrastructure as appropriate to assure this water supply and the ability to move water within our system to where it's needed, and also to be able to support new businesses and new industry that comes to Tempe. So we think we've got a very good handle on this, and it's something that we place a very high priority on every day. It's a big part of running a water utility. So thank you for the question.
Does anyone else have a question or a comment they'd like to make? I'm not seeing any right now in the chat. Well, last call.
Laura and Steve, this is Andy. I guess one thing I'd be interested in, from those here, Kyle presented kind of two options for, the revenue adjustment plans, kind of an equal, levelized, very predictable plan of increases, or one that has a smaller near-term adjustment, but then slightly higher level plan thereafter. And, I guess I was just wondering what this group's reaction was to either of those two plans, and if there was a preference between either of those two options.
Great question. I'm happy to unmute anybody if they would like to speak.
Or just even typing in the chat, the scenario one was the 5.5% level plan versus the scenario two, which had the 2.75% increase. I mean, I'm just kind of curious about what the group's general sentiments are about those, all things considered, predictability, current economic conditions. There's a lot of things to balance depending upon your perspective.
Delia says stable adjustments scenario 1 is her preference. So the 5.5. Phil says he likes scenario 1 as well. Carmen or Cassandra, I don't know if you would like to weigh in at all. There's another question here. This, I believe, is still from Phil. One question, have you had an independent auditor verify these numbers? Which numbers are we talking about? Phil.
While we get maybe clarity on that, Laura, I can speak to just a kind of a couple elements of the different numbers that we used. So for the determining the revenue requirements and the financial forecast and the how much money we need to collect, we do start with audited fund balance information. So beginning fund balances reflect audited expenses, as well as our review of historical results are pulled from financial reports generated by the system that tie out to those audit reports. Additionally, when we look at things like billing data, we do perform revenue tests to ensure the accuracy of the billing information matches to the revenues identified in those financial reports. So to the extent we can, every element of information that we received has either been audited, can be tied back to the audits, or is cross-checked against other available data sources to ensure it's accurate and appropriate for use in the rate-making process.
Carmen, maybe we can clarify a little bit for you. You're saying you can't see anything on your screen. The question is, would you rather see an overall rate increase applied of a smaller number, 2.75, or a larger number, 5.5, with the caveat that subsequent years would be at 6% if we went with the smaller number? I don't know if I portrayed that quite right. Maybe someone else wants to pick it up.
You did, Laura. That's correct.
A miracle.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, you did well. So one option is 2.75% next year, followed by 6% a year thereafter, or the other option is 5.5% every year, an equal level plan every single year.
Carmen says, I'm not sure, but I guess the small increase will be better. The only caveat to that, Carmen, would be that the following year would be 6%. So kind of a bigger increase, a break for this year only. Anyone else have any questions, comments, preferences?
So what's the process from this point on? Where does it go? You have all this information that you've gathered and a little bit of input from people, and where does it go from here?
I can respond to that. This is Terry. The next steps in the process are we finish up the proposed rate adjustments or the study itself. We provide the recommended changes and information to our city management team. They have first review. We make any additional adjustments as necessary. We also get their input in terms of what the report looks like, what the study ends up ultimately being. We share everything with them that we've shared with the stakeholders. We share the input that you've provided. Next steps are we start discussing and preparing council members, letting them know that our recommendations will be forthcoming. We're on the agenda for, I believe, mid-September to provide a preliminary report to a work study session. We receive feedback and input from council based on the information we provided to them. And from there, we go and we make any final adjustments to that, and then we present final, and Steve, you'll have to help me out with the date timeline, but we'll present the final study results in, I don't know if it's October or November, I can't remember, Steve.
Sure. So our recommendation based on the completion of the rate study will go to council on September 17th during the work study session. Following that, if we're going to go through a process of a 60-day notice, assuming council is willing to adopt the rates, we would go back in December to adopt the rates, and the rates would not become effective until February 1st of 2021. And in between that, we're meeting with the Sustainability Commission, the Neighborhood Advisory Commission. We're going to hold several more public meetings, more than likely virtually, just like we did in June. Probably do one on a weekend morning and then one in the afternoon during the weekday. Again, open it up for questions and comments and feedback, basically for the next 2 months. So certainly residents and account holders have an opportunity to share their opinions, not only to us as a staff, but also to mayor and council.
I had one other question, and I don't know what slide it was on, but it was earlier in the presentation. You were talking about a 19%, right? Down at the bottom, it said something about 19%, and you made the comment that you wanted to increase it. Yeah, that one. I think you said that would increase it to 22% or something like that. And you said that that's a number that's used for some sort of a government regulation or something, or I honestly, I lost track of what you were talking about. But the part that I remembered and I thought was, pardon me? Anyway, the part that I was questioning was you said that the rates had been decreased over the years a few times down to 19%, and yet you said it was a very important number that they used in determining something. And I'm wondering why they would decrease it if it was an important number, and why you feel like it's necessary to increase it now.
Yeah, no, so happy to add some clarity to that discussion. So what we're really fundamentally talking about is we need a set amount of money for rates to provide. And there's really two mechanisms at the highest level. One is in the monthly fixed charges that each customer receives before any usage is metered. And then the second's on the volumetric part of it. And so we're just talking about the fixed charges here. And the current amount of revenue that's collected, there's about 19% of overall what we need. And I mentioned that it decreased slightly in the last few years. And that's just been an artifact of the fact that the rate increases the last few times have been just applied to volumetric rates, which means that has grown a little bit as a proportion of overall revenue. And it's decreased this ever so slightly. It's a pretty modest jump back up to 22%. But mainly the point here is we didn't want to see that erode anymore. We wanted to make sure that the utility had a good amount of fixed cost recovery, being above 20%, which helps provide stability for the utility. And it helps when rating agencies, when the utility goes to borrow money, it helps when they look at it to provide a stable outlook. They essentially like to see the fact that not so much of the revenue stream is volatile with changes in usage from year to year, especially in a community like Tempe where you have very large seasonal changes from year to year, potentially.
So they just wanted to see, they want to see your base at a more regulated base number then. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no perfect number, but typically they'll kind of say, really strong utilities and the highest rated utilities are above 30%. The average utilities, though, are typically in the kind of 20%, above 20% range. And so we just wanted to make sure as part of this rate study, we put that recommendation out there, and it would like Tempe to consider keeping their fixed cost recovery above 20%. So we put it at 22.
This is Andy. It just really goes to their desire to see, revenue stability and certainty, and, trying to put that into percentages. So as Kyle was saying, generally the higher that percentage is, the more stable the revenue stream is. So the more favorable, it will be viewed and lead to higher ratings and lower interest rates on future borrowing, which making sure we hit these, kind of rating agency metrics or criteria is important because, as you may recall, we're debt financing a lot of our capital plan. So a lot of that may be through the full faith and credit of the city, but some of it may be through things that are specifically pledged by the utility. And so we want to make sure we've got good financials, for those types of debt instruments if they're used.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, thanks for the clarification.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else have questions? I'm not seeing anything in the chat right now. Delia says, thank you for your comprehensive and professional presentation.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the compliments. We appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for the participation too.
Okay, Laura, well, if you're not seeing anything additional, I'll just reiterate that nice job by Kyle on the presentation, and Andy and Deb for all their work. We appreciate that. We very much appreciate the stakeholder group and your input and all your questions. I know it's sometimes a little frustrating that we can't answer every single question to the affirmative, or that there's some solution to every single individual situation. But we do the best we can in terms of trying to be transparent with our process, being very specific and very analytical in terms of how we put this together, how we analyze the data, knowing that we must be able to defend the structure that we arrive at, that we must be able to defend the figures that we used, and what we present to our city management and council has to be accurate, and it has to be transparent for them as well, so that they can support it. So we do put significant effort alongside our consultant to make sure that that's always the case, and to also always be looking for other opportunities to possibly make further refinements if necessary and where necessary. So some of that you're seeing in this year's study in terms of the fixed charges, but there are other things like that where we always want to do better. AMI is an excellent example of that. As Kyle mentioned, you've moved from having to make certain assumptions based on limited data to having to make very few assumptions due to a volume of data that gives you very specific information that you can base things on. So anyway, that's very important for all of you as stakeholders to know, but also that our community know that we do this. We take this very seriously. We do not come to pricing or rates quickly or haphazardly. We have a very specific way, and we want to make sure people understand it. And as you saw in a couple of the slides, we feel we're very reasonably priced relative to the rest of the valley. We had a slide in one of the previous ones where there's quite a bit of variability from us to other cities across the nation, but fortunately we're not in some of the situations they are currently. Someday we may have to face some of those increasing costs, but not at the moment. So, and also I just want to mention that rates and costs and all the things that go into this study is something we do on a regular basis, every 2 years typically. So it's not as though we go through this process, complete the study, set rates, and then move forward without not planning to review them again. So we're always doing that in terms of making sure we're still in the area we need to be to make sure we ensure the revenue not only of the utility, but that what we're charging is proportional to what it's costing to run the utility. So with that, thank you all again. This has been recorded, so we will post this on the website. I think Steve will probably or one of us will do a follow-up email. So if you have additional questions, you can always share those with us there. You can review this presentation itself. The couple of stakeholders that couldn't make it today indicated that they will be reviewing this. So this is on our rate study website, which we can send back out the link to that if you don't have it. So, but again, I appreciate that. I appreciate all city staff's work on this, and most importantly, your participation and your interest in not only your community, but our water utility and how we're doing business and how we set rates. So thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
You too. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.